Gary Steger lives at the intersection of progressive education and technical education. He's a disciple of the late Seymour Papert, who spent many years at MIT. Gary kind of toggles between preaching the gospel of constructionism, the beneficial educational uses of computers, the way they can help kids of all ages to play and construct and discover and create and collaborate on the one hand, and on the other hand, expressing outrage in memorably colorful language about how so much ed tech in schools is garbage, offering just digital bells and whistles to tarred up, mind-numbing traditionalism. It's the best of tools and the worst of tools, if I can be Dickensian about it, or binary about it, which seems appropriate. Gary's books include Invent to Learn, which he wrote with his wife, Sylvia Martinez. He works with teachers all over the world. At his peak, he was racking up more frequent flyer miles in a month than I and many other people did in a year. Educational technology, computers in classrooms. When are they appealing? When are they appalling? A conversation with Gary Steger on this edition of Kohn Zone. I'm Alfie Kohn. Gary Steger, you and I have crossed paths in a lot of different ways. What fun to create a new place for us to interact on this podcast. I'm glad to have you with me. So I thought I would ask to begin with, why is it that traditional schools seem at least as excited about ed tech as schools that you and I would view as authentic and exciting and progressive? Do you agree with my premise? And if you do, why do we find this?
I think the marriage of traditional schooling and ed tech is at its apex right now. Through a confluence of factors. The fantasies of replacing teachers with machines have existed forever. But there's a gold rush associated with AI that I understand a bit, but not totally, that's allowing ed tech to be used to sustain and amplify and calcify the sort of weakest parts of the school system. As opposed to the reason why I got involved, which was, first of all, the educational technology community, or we call that educational computing, which I think is an important distinction. In the early 1980s was where the most radical, wisest, progressive educators were, folks who came out of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and voting rights and anti-war movements, who saw computers as a way of not just teaching kids things we've always wanted to teach them with greater efficiency or efficacy or rigor, but to create opportunities to learn and do and know and democratize knowledge construction in ways that were unimaginable before. And there used to be competing visions of what that meant in education. But we find ourselves in a moment where I'm routinely put in the uncomfortable position of having to defend the defenseless. That these poor inanimate objects are being blamed for the worst proclivities and inclinations of humans.
So one of the things that makes your work so interesting is that you offer a really fleshed out version of what good tech or good computing in schools looks like, drawing on the work of Seymour Papert. And at the same time, you offer a scathing critique of what you view as bad tech in school. And I want to sort of walk our way through the distinction as well as examples of each. You said at one point, too much of ed tech is passive, trivial, performative, manipulative, or worse, but that need not be the case. So let's start with the bad stuff. What are the examples of the use of computers and other forms of technology in school that you think is making things worse?
Managing children, delivering instruction, narrowing the curriculum to turn kids into question answering ATMs. There's been a sort of sci-fi fantasy of, like I said earlier, using computers to replace teachers or intelligent tutors forever, which is essentially just electronic flashcards. And yet, the venture capital money won't stop chasing that fantasy, because as you know, as your work demonstrates, it's so deeply ingrained in our notions of what teaching and learning are. One of the big problems with ed tech is a lot of the folks involved can't differentiate between teaching and learning. And I think you can generalize this to education more widely, but that if you believe that learning is the direct result of having been taught, then you're going to use computers in a specific way. And if you believe, as I do, that computers can be an intellectual laboratory and vehicle for self-expression that allow you to create and do and collaborate and make things that were impossible to make before, then we're amplifying human potential. We're allowing kids to go further than they could have ever gone on their own.
So are you saying that it's mistaken ideas and ideology about learning itself rather than pressure from big tech that leads schools to adopt these problematic approaches?
Sure. I mean, when I'm at an educational technology conference, invariably colleagues who share our perspectives on teaching and learning will say to me, "But look at the exhibit hall. It's all because of these folks who are trying to make a killing on this stuff." And the ed tech budget isn't like the annual revenue of ShamWow, or the Scrub Daddy. It's a rounding error. The ideology, I think, drives this a lot more than profits.
Okay.
Although if you could get humans out of the system entirely, if you could dismantle the public education system, I think the tech bros are much more interested in turning public treasure into a private plaything. I often think of Bill Gates and Gomez Adams with his train set, blowing up the trains. That I think explains it a lot more than any kind of profit motive, because there's been good money after bad thrown at this fantasy forever. I don't think that it's purely capitalism that's infected this, and I think some of this is an abdication of the role of educators. In the late 1970s, early 80s, there used to be discussions about what's a computer for in education. Bob Taylor of Columbia University wrote a book called Computers in the Classroom, Tool, Tutor, Tutee, that there were different perspectives on what the computer could be used for. In my work with Seymour Papert, he once said that, the computer can benefit one of three constituent groups: the system, the teachers, or the learner. And my emphasis is on the greatest return on investment, which is, as I said before, amplifying the potential of each learner, of allowing them to do creative things that are intellectually rewarding and sophisticated, as opposed to being a prop for the teacher, to manage unruly children or to anesthetize them or to get them to comply with some mediocre standards, or from the system, which is to control what the teachers and students are doing and for record keeping and surveillance.
So when you talk about return on investment, of course, you're using the phrase figuratively, but the literal return on investment that Alphabet that owns Google wants only goes so far, you seem to be saying. They can offer crap to schools, but if the schools say no thanks, then there's only so far they can get. So the question is why so many schools are saying, yes, please, let's have more of this.
Well, Alphabet's an interesting case because Alphabet's playing a long game where they want to lock you into their ecosystem forever.
Right.
Right. So
does
they're
Apple.
they're not selling third grade curricular flashcards. They're selling, you're going to use our stuff in every moment of your day forever. And it's interesting how they got into schools. Again, because of the gullibility, I think, of educators who really believed in free. There's no such thing as free software. And one of the problems with ed tech is there used to be really creative people, not a lot of them, but there used to be a handful of small companies that were really doing innovative work to create software that would allow kids to do great things. And most of those are gone. And what's been left is sort of garbage and these sort of utilities like Google. And the irony of it is 35 years ago, I led professional development in the first two schools in which we gave every kid a laptop. And we dramatically transformed everything that happened in those schools. The schools became more project-based. Class size mattered. Teachers were looking at kids and their work and their potential in different ways. They started creating interdisciplinary classes. That humanities teachers said, we need to spend 3 hours a day uninterrupted on personally meaningful projects. And we're willing to teach multiple subjects in order to achieve that objective because we saw through the eyes and the hands and the screens of the kids what were possible. And Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of the MIT Media Lab, used to say, no one washes a rental car. When you return your car to Avis, you don't take it to be vacuumed first. You just dump all the crap in it and bring it back. When it's your computer and it's your intellectual partner, and it's where you store your ideas and where you craft them, then you take care of it. You have a sense of ownership of not only the thing, but the ideas that are being generated within it. And then the web came along and Google saw an opportunity to make this sort of inferior, intellectually impotent device that was more passive, that would allow schools to control it. And they said, hey, but everything's free on here. All the software is free. And that was really attractive. What schools never seem to take into account are the armies of paraprofessionals, the IT department that's now running everything, as opposed to educators. And I've worked in the most progressive, affluent, lovely schools in the world with really dynamic, intelligent school principals who work for the IT guy. It's as if, the schools had been handed over to the custodians in some ways.
Well, let's back up for a minute. You talk about how a while ago, all the kids got their own laptop. Forget about whether it's a laptop or a Chromebook or whatever. If all you heard about a given school is we've decided to give every kid his or her own computer in the year 2025, would you be optimistic about what's going to result from that?
Well, I'd start by saying it's ridiculous that we're still having the argument. Because as Seymour Papert said, about 25 years ago, when Maine was talking about a laptop for every kid, he said, the real question is, well, why would it even occur to you to deny kids access to the primary instrument for doing intellectual and creative work today? Having said that, one of my colleagues, Ron Canuel in Quebec, found that when they gave every kid a laptop, it made good teachers better. It made okay teachers good, and it made bad teachers worse. That it amplified kind of in all directions. And in fact, much of what's being done with computers in schools, as I said before, is kind of indefendable or undefendable. It's a lot of rote nonsense. It's a lot of note taking. It's a lot of regurgitation. It's a lot of test prep. It's a lot of shoot down the lowest common denominator. As opposed to using it to be, I think the computer allows us to be historians rather than being taught history, to be mathematicians rather than being taught math, to be artists and composers and scientists rather than being taught those things. So this is within the grand progressive tradition of learning by doing. And my work is centered around the question of what can kids do, which is why I've been really proud to work with my colleagues in Reggio Emilia over the past couple of years to think about the ways in which computing is not only consistent with their ideals of early childhood development, but can actually create opportunities that didn't exist before.
Okay, so it allows all this great stuff to take place, but obviously it doesn't guarantee that it will. So what I'm trying to get at here is what distinguishes the good from the bad version of a given idea, including but not limited to each kid gets her own laptop. Is it more about how these ideas are implemented or why they're going in this direction?
It's clearly a matter of vision and leadership. When we started one-to-one computing, I said that I observed that there were three kinds of schools that got a laptop for every kid. There were the pioneers, the folks who were quoting Seymour Papert and Ted Sizer and Loris Malaguzzi and Herb Cole, and were viewing computers as a way of explicitly making the classroom more learner-centered, more collaborative, more creative. And they provided the sort of institutional support and professional development that allowed people like myself to spend months at a time working in classrooms with teachers who were excited about what was possible with the students that they cared for. And then there was a second group of schools, which were the marketeers. Those were the folks who just wanted to issue the press release saying, we've done this. And the third group was their neighbors, because there was an inevitability to it that regardless of the motivation of the first two groups, everyone else was going to eventually do it as well. And so if you lack any kind of coherent vision for how kids should spend 7 hours a day, and God forbid, into the night with things like homework, then that defines the way that you'd use computers. And we need to find a cure for amnesia, in solving a lot of these educational problems. When a school leader says to me, if only we knew what to do, I swing by my house. I have a few thousand books I could lend you. There were research studies about the efficacy of our work and books written about it and hundreds of articles, and there's videos and people who are still alive who can tell you how to do it. And yet we keep pretending that this is one easy, automatic, and that it's sort of there's a techno-determinism that, just as you imply, just handing the kids the things will transform education. I'm personally fascinated by the explosion of employees in schools with the titles Director of Innovation. And I'm finding it almost ironic, because the person with that title is often the one with the fewest receipts for having innovated in any way.
Right. My kids' schools used to brag about innovation because now the textbook was on an iPad, right? So some of the people may be amnesiacs. They forgot how to do it, and some may be just scrambling to keep up with the crowd, but others, and I think you're saying this as well, although you're also saying, interestingly, a lot of other things to explain what's going on, is that some people are using these new techniques, these new methods, these new materials and equipment to more efficiently get to the goals they've always had, which have never changed. Memorizing facts, and sometimes, as you pointed out, managing students and so on, right? You're by giving all of these great books and examples of what you're doing, is that really going to convince people whose whole idea of learning is completely different from yours?
No, evidence is no match for ideology.
Right.
And we live in an age, I think, of rising pedagogical authoritarianism. All this nonsense of science of this or that, science of reading, science of learning. I think the only antidote to that is reifying, reanimating, reinvesting in the art of teaching.
Tell me about flipped classrooms, which were billed as a big step forward.
This is one of those sort of zombie ideas that I forget about for 10 years and then it comes back from the dead. I don't get it. First of all, it justifies homework, which you and I share our view on, that kids shouldn't work at a second unpaid shift, that it creates all sorts of inequities, that it's not particularly valuable. I want to live in a world where kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to school to work on something that matters to them, and where their teachers wake up every morning and ask themselves, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? And the flipped classroom at its best was an acknowledgement that kids could be doing meaningful things, at least part of the day, as long as you preserved plenty of time for the less meaningful, drudgerous things, arduous, torturous stuff. And it's one of those ideas that was simple enough that a whole lot of folks sort of glommed onto it. But one of the two creators of it, who was a good guy from my interactions with him, he's already lost interest in it and went on to another career. So I don't get it.
This is connected with Khan Academy, right? Which is
it goes way before Khan Academy.
Oh, the idea of flipping classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of rooted in ASCD. There was a guy, Aaron Sams, and some other, I can't think of the other guy's name, who's still around, promoting the idea. And then guys like Kohn sort of picked it up.
What do you think of Khan Academy?
I think anyone who wants to make flashcards and workbooks has a right to do so. What I have problems with is him having unfettered access to the carders of power and being able to legislate that for everyone's children. One of the things I've come to try to understand the sort of thinking of people like Bill Gates and the other sort of oligarchs who dabble in education. And I think the most generous view of their interest is and where they've gone wrong. Because after all, Gates originally funded the big picture schools. But then he got completely lost interest in it. And they're still flourishing and growing and doing great things for kids. But for whatever reason, it didn't sort of match his ideology. And like I think the most generous view of guys like Gates and Kohn is that they lack empathy. That their view of education is completely entangled with how they believe they learned. And so, Bill Gates loves telling stories about he read a book by a historian and he thought it was fabulous. And instead of calling the historian up and saying, hey, I'd like to buy your book for any educator who would like to use it, his first call was to the governor of pick a state and said, I want you to impose this book on every teacher in the state. Right? And I think that when I use the term pedagogical authoritarianism, I used it in a deliberate fashion. I think there's this notion of I alone can fix it, that there is one way to learn. And it's through, this sort of explicit direct instruction, which incidentally, as you much more expert at than I am, fails at first contact with an actual child. Because there's no other way to explain my 6-year-old granddaughter's postdoc in Disney princesses, or how my 9-year-old grandson can talk about Willie the Lion Smith, or fact check NFL trivia books. The kids know stuff. Kids are capable. They're competent, and my use of computers, as I said before, is to build upon that competence and confidence and creativity and courage that kids have when it's not suppressed by adults, to allow them to do things and explore domains and construct knowledge in ways that were impossible otherwise.
So if it's basically automated flashcards, we're not going to make much progress no matter what RAM the computer has. I assume you feel the same way about smart boards, interactive whiteboards, which a lot of schools have pointed to as how technologically savvy we are now?
Well, the smart board, the interactive whiteboard, was a great prop, while simultaneously reinforcing the dominance of the front of the room. And
Yeah.
a lot of educators would say to me, well, but we have the kids come up and use the smart board. And I said, well, then you're just replacing the larger instructor with a smaller one. That it's the exact same use, and they're largely, like, the old joke about, if you got rid of the treadmill, where would I hang my sport jacket? I was actually working at a school, you would have loved this moment, Alfie, where there was like a giant crash after school one day, and we ran into the adjacent classroom to see what had happened, and the television, which was mounted on the ceiling, that was being used for instructionist purposes to deliver content to, unsuspecting, unwilling, coerced children, had jumped out of its mounting and taken out the interactive whiteboard in a murder suicide, which was quite
That's
fantastic.
Great metaphor. Anyone who was for an English class to teach how metaphors work. Yeah.
And by the way, if you don't care about any of our educational arguments, apparently you can't dispose of an interactive whiteboard either. It's like trying to get rid of a plutonium plant. They're just giant hunks of toxic waste, and they're educational waste and actually environmental waste as well. But they again allowed you to sort of appear modern. Without actually changing any practices.
Innovative.
I mean, I find it hilarious when I read people comparing whatever the latest technology is, good or bad, to, well, you remember when the controversy over calculators in the classroom or word processing in the classrooms, and I can make a pretty strong case that neither calculators or word processing has changed instruction very much. Mm-hmm. I know you talked to Joe Bowler, and someone we both admire. The symbol for multiplication in a math book is still not the one that's been used by calculators and computers for like a third of a century. So I mean, just at the simplest level, it's had almost no impact on what actually happens in classrooms. And last thing I want to say about guys like Kohn is, they're building lovely project-based, progressive, collaborative, student-centered schools for their own children.
Yeah.
And from the Koch brothers to Kohn to Zuckerberg, they want a different educational diet for their children than they want for other people's. And right. I was at a conference with Kohn, and he was saying things like, to this, rapt applause by the audience of folks who should know better about, why do we have to have grades and age segregation and, curriculums in silos? Can't kids be working on meaningful projects? And I said, hey, Sal, I've got a rental car out front. Hop in. I'll take you to see the future. There's this sort of ignorance or willful ignorance that alternatives actually exist. There's this
but for
narcissism right. And there's this narcissism that history begins with me. Uh-huh. Right. Even when it comes to AI, most of the really good work in AI has its roots in places like the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, where their unofficial motto was computers are for children. And a lot of the early research was based on Piaget. Mm-hmm. And if you can understand how children learn and think, you could understand how computers might do it. And by children interacting with computers, you could learn a lot more about how children think and learn. And and then we've had kind of 30 or 40 years of industrial research into creating systems that would be better at winning at Jeopardy, as opposed to solving real problems or amplifying human potential.
So help me understand this. If computers can be used for these amazing purposes, and we'll talk more about how, but must computers be involved for learning to be student-centered and creative? Can you imagine a classroom in a school devoted to all the progressive, constructivist, student-centered, collaborative exploration that you and I love, and there's nothing with a battery and there's nothing that plugs in?
Banned.
Well, no, I don't just mean for a specific topic like music. I mean across the board for language arts and math and science. In other words, computers aren't sufficient for good education, but are they necessary for it?
They're adding colors to the crayon box. They're expanding the breadth and depth and range of projects that are possible.
Okay. And you think only computers can expand or enhance it in that way?
No, I think clay and paint and Cuisinart rods and cameras and can do that as well.
Okay.
But the computer is kind of the protean machine that can take on a lot of those forms and do things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. I mean, one of the things Seymour Papert argued was that we could have progressive project-based learning in most subjects, but mathematics is sort of dependent on it, that we didn't have the material for making mathematics without a computer. So, I mean, I'm making a distinction between digital and computational, and some of this stuff is kind of,
Say a word more about that distinction.
A lot of what happens in schools is digital, which one of the things my colleagues in Reggio Emilia helped me come to articulate is digital is just a space. It's kind of the form. And computational is the verb. It's a way of making sense of the world. It's the way of communicating formal ideas coherently enough to get a reasonably smart computer to do something for you. And I've got lots of examples of second or third graders messing about with mathematics, for example, in ways that are wholly consistent with what an actual mathematician does, as opposed to being drilled in facts, where kids can have an idea and explore it, where they can test hypotheses, where they can engage in debugging, where they can build models of things, where they can actually mess about with ideas that would have been inaccessible to all but a small percentage of postdocs.
So you're defining the word computational to be coextensive with all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's the verb.
To compute?
It's the using.
How is it a verb?
Well, yeah, well, you're right. Or an adverb. It's the using computers in a non-passive way to construct knowledge, to make things.
Yeah.
And that we wrote a book called Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom, which has been very successful and translated into 10 languages. And the maker movement, which emerged 15 or so years ago, excited a lot of people because it gave license for making things again in classrooms, which just should have never disappeared in the first place. I'm old enough to remember when there were hammers and nails and saws in kindergarten classrooms in New York City. But that all disappeared. And so this was a way of resurrecting it or bringing it back into classrooms. But one of the powerful ideas of the maker movement, particularly a vision of it that came out of places like the MIT Media Lab, was you can make things with bits and atoms. You can make things with your hands, tangible things, but you could also make things with ideas and with theories and with number. And big surprise, schools have done a lot of cutting up of cardboard and taping things together and making shoebox dioramas, and they left the powerful ideas behind.
So channeling your Seymour Papert here, which I know you do regularly, walk us through the difference between constructivism and constructionism.
So constructivism is the Piagetian idea that knowledge is constructed at the learner, that inside the learner, that the learner is central to the learning process, that and the locus of control is with the learner. Papert, who worked with Piaget and helped Piaget understand how children construct mathematical knowledge, and went on to become the father of educational computing, one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence, liked playing with words, and said the best way to ensure that knowledge construction occurs is through the act of making something, and constructing something shareable.
Mhm.
Now, that shareable doesn't have to be a paper mache, um, you know, llama. It could also be an idea or a theory. And he made an important distinction. He wasn't all that wed to constructionism as a pursuit or a cornerstone of his work. He didn't talk about it very much. He said, Piaget wasn't all that crazy about stage theory and didn't focus on formal operations very much in his work. That's just kind of what they became popular for. But Papert made a much more important distinction between instructionism and constructionism,
Mhm.
which is the stance that determines how you're going to use computers or anything else in a classroom. What's going to happen if you're engaged in the business of education? So that instructionists believe that knowledge is the result of having been taught. It's a treatment model. It's something someone imposes upon you. It's something that someone does to you. It's a new textbook. It's a new test. It's a new dance. It's a new pedagogical approach. It's team teaching, more teachers, bigger teacher, smaller teacher. While constructionism is the notion that the learner is the one who does the learning, and that knowledge construction is through the act of making something.
Yeah, the second part is what distinguishes, I gather, from constructivism. Is constructionism pretty much synonymous with the maker movement?
There's a funny, well, we tried to make that connection when we said to the maker movement, hey, there's a term for this, because there'd been this work being done around constructionism for a couple decades before. But now, I was at a constructionism conference in Zurich in June, and there's this weird Venn diagram of groups that are embracing constructionism. There's computer science faculty who think that if they give a few fewer quizzes, they're constructionists. Or if the students can if they can give the students the illusion of freedom long enough to solve a problem that's already been solved before they say, no, that's not correct, then they're constructionists. There's the makers who are kind of had a good intuition about constructionism, and a few other kind of groups.
But those are people using the terms incorrectly to justify more of the status quo. I'm trying to get a handle on the ideal types here, used to find accurately what distinguishes these ideas.
I don't want to be the arbiter of all things constructionist, except to contribute that I think that when we think about the philosophical gulf, the choices, the stance that we assume about education, I don't think it falls neatly into liberal, conservative, or Republican, Democrat, or any of those kind of binaries, as well as you can really identify what someone believes about teaching and learning if you can figure out if they're an instructionist or a constructionist. Do they believe that learning is done to someone, or do they believe that the learner learns?
Okay. And you have this cluster of messages pushing for kids to be at the center and to be involved as initiators of their learning. And I asked you a minute ago whether you find more or less receptivity in other countries versus the US. And I heard you say, no, that's not a relevant distinction. So now I'm wondering if you can make a different generalization about who's more responsive and excited by your message. Do you find more receptivity in private versus public schools, in elementary versus high schools? Is there any other distinction that you've picked up over the years?
So I have to answer the question a couple different ways. I don't know that there's a difference in receptivity as much as who I have access to. and who has access to me. And I suspect you have similar experience that the public system folks don't have the level of access that private system folks have. So I'm a dyed in the wool, will defend to my last breath the importance of strong, democratic, creative, learner-centered, community-based public schools. And I've done an embarrassing amount of work in the private sector.
Yeah.
And I find so, and then I want to say two more things. I find private schools who have infinite potential and resources to be the most perhaps disappointing in this scenario, because they can buy anything. They do. And they're the ones who can say, sure, we're doing direct, explicit phonics instruction, and they're hiring the guy who's talking about medieval classroom management techniques, because they can issue the press release saying we've done that, and they can tell anxious parents that that's all part of the offering in their school, when they don't actually believe any of it, and it doesn't harm their student population. And well, they simultaneously create the conditions in which legislation and public sentiment imposes that on more defenseless populations of children and communities that can less afford such pedagogical authoritarianism. I mean, there's always been a distinction between constructionist and instructionist uses of technology that have fallen largely along socioeconomic lines. Right. That and so, it tracks to access to instrumental music instruction, or being able to perform Pippin, or the sort of stuff that brings joy and meaning and beauty and color and light to school. The other observation that I'll share with you is when I get hired to work with a high school, my expectations are, measured. They're more sober. I know, high schools are harder to change. They've got the bells and cells, and, they have to get kids ready for college and blah, 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 blah. And what I'm finding now is that I'm perhaps more disappointed in what I'm finding in elementary schools, because elementary schools have become mini community colleges, where every 43 minutes the kids move on to some other subject with another teacher who doesn't know them quite as well, who's the math specialist.
More departmentalization at younger ages.
Right. And more tracking and less project work and less interdisciplinary work. And that means teachers not only don't know about how the sixth graders can write a musical that every kid in the school performs in, or how you can take a novel and use it to teach math or science or history. But they don't know the children as well either. And I think all the sort of pathologies of school sort of, are amplified by that. There's greater discipline problems, more ennui, more apathy.
You mean more than in high school, or more than there used to be in elementary school?
It's a good question. Certainly more than there used to be. And it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't more than in high school, because by high school, the kids are in on the cosmic joke, and they've come up with coping strategies where they know how to sort of get through the nonsense. Where, I'll give you an example. My grandson, who's a voracious reader and fascinated by a million things and remembers every conversation he's ever overheard, whether he was supposed to overhear it or not, and can wax poetic on a remarkable array of subjects. I bought him a book that I thought he would like, some kid's book. And I handed it to him, and he held it at arm's length, and he went, this seems to be a 3.2. I'm a 5.3. And he tossed the book.
And reading level, you mean?
Yeah.
Great.
And I wanted to, inflict great bodily harm on his teacher. But, I had to love my grandson, and, was able to have a conversation with him about how, pleasure reading doesn't come in, deciles, and that he might actually, that there's all sorts of stories he might enjoy regardless of what some arbitrary rating or ranking some ridiculous adult has imposed on it. So there's these ways where I think we may be doing more harm to little kids by compartmentalizing school. And I just find that, when folks ask me, or in the odd occasion where I've been in a position of hiring teachers, the CV, the resume that jumps to the top of the pile is the one that says worked at summer camp.
You mean that's who they are favoring, or who you think they should be favoring?
That's who I favor. That's who they should be favoring. Because that's the person who is teaching for the right reasons, because they don't want to be a prison guard. They want to spend time in the company of nutty kids. That's the person who can be resourceful and keep 18, 7-year-olds happily engaged in something when it's raining for 4 straight days and you're told you can't leave the ping pong table. Right. The teachers that I work with, the folks that I've built a faculty around my Constructing Modern Knowledge Institute, where we could be walking down the street and see something happen, or see an item on a store shelf or a headline in a newspaper, and I can point at it and raise an eyebrow. And those folks, like myself, have 7 million ideas for how that can provoke really deep learning adventures for kids, whether they're 4 years old or a graduate student. That I think in a lot of ways was born of my preparation to become a teacher, where I learned how to do all of these things. I'll tell you, if you have a second, one of my favorite anecdotes with Seymour Papert. We built this, nutty, in learning environment inside the state of Maine's troubled prison for teenagers, a place where the state of Maine actually pled guilty to torturing children, where they were being accused of abusing kids by Amnesty International. And we wandered in like these, happy-go-lucky hippies who said, we're not going to look at the kids, IEPs. We're going to let them work 5 hours a day uninterrupted on personally meaningful projects. We built a great library. We had a dark room and a little carpentry area and lots of Lego and robotics materials. Every kid had their own computer. And in 3.5 years, we didn't have a single kid who had to leave for discipline reasons. But we really wanted to focus on their learning and interest and curiosity and creativity and confidence and competence, and take them from where they were and produce some sort of progress, some growth, as Dewey described learning. And one of the ways to accomplish that was to ensure that we could maintain a strong sense of community, that we were learning as a group as opposed to in a group, which is something Carlo Rinaldi taught me. And so we fought like hell. I mean, it was really, really difficult to get the bureaucracy to allow us to abide by Title IX and actually have boys and girls in phys ed together. And we didn't want them to go to the phys ed teacher. We wanted to run the phys ed class ourselves, and I wanted to do it. And we took the kids to the gym one day, and we had 13-year-olds and 20-year-olds and big kids and little kids and boys and girls all participating. And I honestly don't remember if it was wiffle ball or basketball or something. And on the way back to the classroom, Seymour Papert, this great intellect, the person who had to flee South Africa for fighting apartheid in the late 40s and 50s when Mandela, and helped Piaget understand how children learn mathematics, and was a pioneer in all kinds of technological fields and had 2 PhDs in mathematics, turned to me and asked me, how do you know how to do that? Meaning, keep a dozen kids playing something for an hour.
Yeah, not everybody can do that, no matter what academic qualifications they have.
It was the first time it had ever occurred to me that was a thing. And I think it came from camp, and it came from the fact that I actually had some classes as an undergraduate where teaching was viewed as an art, and where we practiced doing some of those kinds of things.
Let me wrap up with a couple of specific related examples of tech, because you've thought so long over your career about the use of technology. What do you think of cell phone bans in schools? And by extension, what do you think of the social media and its effects on kids that they're getting by way of those phones.
Well, first of all, I think we should be able to differentiate between hardware and software.
Okay.
And just like we should be able to differentiate between teaching and learning, we failed to be able to do that. And we seem to be blaming these inanimate objects for all sorts of social ills. I think if you want to legislate about social media, it's worth discussing. But I think that history is not going to look kindly on the banning of cell phones. I think it's a distraction. In fact, this is the third cell phone ban we've been through. There was one around 2000, and then about 10 years later, New York City banned them. They abandoned that idea. One of the first things that happened after New York City banned cell phones, overnight, a cottage industry of vans parked in front of schools, shaking down poor children for $5 a day to store their phones emerged. And I think that as the educators of Reggio Emilia teach us, it's irresponsible to build pens around children. That we have to find ways to constructively engage them in their world. And there are benefits of using a phone. From, I found myself at a presentation once recently where I was taking a photo of someone's slide. And as I was doing it, as I raised my hands to take the photo, the voice in my head said, "You're never going to look at this picture again." But then I realized that this was, in fact, a form of curation. I might look at it again. And this was a way of me saying to myself, you should be paying attention to what he's saying right now. And there are certainly all kinds of uses for it. I don't think it's going to age well. And what are we going to ban next? And when the phone is in your shoe, what are we going to do? And when ChatGPT is installed at birth, what are we going to do? I mean, are we going to have kids, naked in classrooms like they're cutting cocaine, so that they don't steal anything? I think it's a bad idea to artificially raise the antagonism level between adults and children. We should be lowering that. Now, let me just say something from a policy perspective. If your school thinks that cell phones shouldn't be allowed in the classroom, God bless you. You should make that decision. I have no issue with it. But first of all, don't congratulate yourself for being some sort of, visionary. And in fact, one of the schools that I helped embrace laptops and constructionism in 1992 has manufactured their own dumb phone that's school branded, and they're requiring every child in their school to have the smartphone their affluent parents have already bought their child, and a dumb one as well that has a school logo on it. Mm-hmm. What my problem is passing legislation and even just contagious ideas that make life more difficult for less advantaged children, who in some cases, the cell phone might be a lifeline. It's a thing that calls the police when some madman comes in with a gun. It's a way of a parent being able to reach their kids when they have to go somewhere else for after school care because their babysitter plan fell through. It's a way of answering, looking up no kid in any of my classrooms should ever ask, what does that mean? Or how do you spell that? Because they have the means of answering that question for themselves. That there's all sorts of benefits to having the thing, not the least of which being we just shouldn't be arbitrarily mean to children. And I also don't think we should be taking educational advice from a no-show business school professor.
So you might work with kids to figure out how to use the phones they bring to school in a way that is more constructive rather than an absolute ban, regardless of the age level.
And controlling your impulses. Can I tell two quick anecdotes that are directly related to this? One was when we were working in the prison, every kid had a computer, and we thought, well, if they play games, that'll inspire them to create their own games. And one of the ideas that had been sort of popular among us constructionists for a long time was, you can play any game that you programmed. And so that was an invitation for kids to be creative and to make things. And we had really great experience with kids doing that. And even if the game wasn't as good as Grand Theft Auto, it was theirs. So in some ways it was better. And kids were excited about it. And they learned all kinds of math and computer science and engineering. And, and they worked in teams to do art and design and programming. Well, we didn't expect that when we were working in a prison for teenagers that some of these kids actually were psychologically damaged and had impulse control problems. And after months of, you can play games only in the afternoon. You can play games between 2 and 3. You can play games only after you've worked on your project for X amount of time. Seymour Papper and my colleague David Cavallo and John Stetson and I assembled the kids in a circle, and Seymour said to them, and they knew he was a really smart guy who cared about them. And Seymour said, kids, we've spent 3 or 4 months trying to figure out a way to have games on your computers without you getting completely distracted all the time and being obsessed with them. And frankly, I'm stumped. And so we're going to erase all the games from your hard drives. And the kids all said, oh, okay. Because there was a level of trust and they were actually, I think, kind of intrigued by the idea that this smart guy sort of said to them, look, we tried and I just don't understand, and maybe we're going to have to go in a different direction. Last year I was working in a school in Australia. I do crazy things sometimes, like teach 240 7th graders, each with a laptop in one space for 7 hours straight, because I want to create models for teachers of how things need not be as they seem. And if I have a multi-age class or hundreds of kids for a long period of time, maybe they'll look in and say, what's going on here, and recognize that things need not be as they seem. And one class was 7th grade, and I was playing with computation and solving an impossible number theory problem, unsolved number theory problem. And one was involved in some engineering challenges with robotics and microcontrollers. And so suffice to say, me, 200 to 250 7th or 8th graders who I never met before in one room for an entire school day. No discipline issues. And at the end of the day, one of the kids came up to me and said, can I get a selfie with you? And he reached into his bag and he took a selfie with me. And then a couple other kids politely asked if they could as well, which was kind of touching. And then it occurred to me, all these kids had cell phones. There were no issues all day.
So sometimes when kids are pulling out their phones, it says less about the damaging impact of phones and the need to restrict access to them, and more about why they need distraction in the first place and what's happening in the classroom otherwise. Beautiful. That's a great way to, at least that possibility, even if it's not definitive, is a great note to end on.
It certainly is the case in my life.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate your provocations, informed by all your experience over the decades and thinking not only about technology, but the larger educational context in which we evaluate technology, a context that too often is missing from our conversation.
No, you're welcome, Alfie. And I want to thank you for your clarity and courage and remarkable ability to force educators to confront their compromises. I think that's the most important contribution that you've made. Folks find it very difficult to disagree with what you say. They're just uncomfortable with the fact that it's been said, and that they have to sort of reconcile the compromises that they make on a daily basis in their lives as parents and teachers. And I think that's a really important contribution. I'm grateful for your support and friendship and collegiality over the years.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And perhaps you've done the same thing even in the last hour with respect to compromises and helping people to rethink these ideas.
Thanks.